Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life, only visible when someone needs a favor? Have you ever noticed that the more you give, the less people seem to value you? Have you ever realized that your kindness isn't a bridge, it's a green light for people to walk all over you? Niccolò Machiavelli once wrote a truth that most people are too afraid to say out loud. Your kindness isn't a shield. In the wrong hands, it's a target. If you don't learn how to gate your generosity, you aren't being a saint. You're being a victim. We are taught that being nice is the ultimate virtue, but today, we're going to deconstruct that lie. We explore the dark psychology of respect and how to reclaim your power. If you're tired of being the reliable one who always finishes last, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's time you learned how to be respected, not just used. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Gary C. Charles. Gary was the perfect man. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave, and the guy who never said no. He thought he was building a legacy of love, but he was actually building his own coffin. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll see the exact moment Gary realized that scarcity creates value, and the three-word sentence he used to turn his exploiters into his subordinates. You might find that Gary's biggest mistake is the exact one you're making right now. Chapter 1. The Infinite Giver Gary C. Charles lived his life as a monument to other people's convenience. In the quiet, blue light hours before the sun rose, Gary was already at his desk, the first to arrive, setting the stage for everyone else's success. He was the man who stayed until the cleaning crew arrived, his silhouette framed against the glass of a darkening office, finishing reports that weren't his and fixing mistakes he didn't make. To the world, Gary was a saint. To Gary, he was a man waiting for a debt of gratitude that was never intended to be paid. His world was a relentless cycle of yes. When a colleague needed a weekend shift covered, Gary was there. When a neighbor needed a loan that would never be returned, Gary's wallet was open. He wore his exhaustion like a badge of honor, masking the dark circles under his eyes with a polite, practiced smile. He believed, with a naive and desperate fervor, that if he just gave enough of himself, the world would eventually reward him with the respect he craved. But the thank you never came. Instead, his coworkers stopped asking for favors and started giving orders. His kindness had ceased to be a gift and had become an expectation, a utility, like electricity or running water. People didn't appreciate the light Gary provided. They only complained when it flickered. As he sat alone in the hollow silence of his apartment each night, drained of his energy and his resources, Gary began to feel the cold realization that Machiavelli had warned of. He was being destroyed by his own goodness. He was building a legacy of service, but he was doing it on the foundation of his own slow disappearance. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 2, where we see the specific moment the exploitation turns from subtle to unbearable? Chapter 2. The Cost of Being Useful. The specific moments of betrayal, the stolen promotion, the unpaid debts, and the realization that his friends only call him when their cars break down. The degradation of Gary C. Charles's spirit didn't happen with a roar, but with the quiet, persistent dripping of entitlement. It was in the casual way his manager, a man who had climbed to his position on the rungs of Gary's midnight labor, looked him in the eye and handed the senior director promotion to a louder, less competent stranger. The excuse was a jagged pill. "We need you right where you are, Gary. You're the engine that keeps this place running." He realized then that being indispensable was just a polite way of being trapped. He was too useful to promote, too reliable to reward, and too silent to respect. The betrayal bled into his private hours, where his phone only vibrated with the weight of other people's crises. There was the cousin who borrowed $3,000 for a business venture, but was seen on social media toasting drinks in Bali, conveniently forgetting the debt while Gary ate generic pasta in the dark to save on utilities. There were the friends who hadn't asked how he was in 3 years, yet suddenly found his number the moment a transmission failed or a basement flooded. Gary became a human toolkit, a roadside assistance service disguised as a person. He sat in his car one rainy Tuesday, staring at a text message asking for a quick favor from someone who had ignored his birthday a week prior. The realization hit him with a Machiavellian coldness. They didn't love him. They loved his utility. He was a battery being drained to power lives he wasn't even invited to share. His kindness hadn't bought him a seat at the table. It had only made him the most comfortable chair in the room. Should we move to Chapter 3, where Gary meets the mentor who introduces him to the cold, liberating logic of strategic boundaries? Chapter 3. The Machiavellian Lesson, the Encounter with the Mentor. The lesson on strategic cruelty. Sometimes you must let things fail so people realize how much you were carrying. The breaking point finally arrived in the form of a quiet, dimly lit corner of a cigar lounge, where Gary C. Charles sat across from a man who had built empires on the ruins of sentimental men. This was Elias Thorne, a retired titan of industry who saw Gary's exhaustion not as a badge of honor, but as a fatal strategic error. Gary spoke of his loyalty and his tireless efforts, waiting for Thorne to validate his suffering. Instead, the old man leaned forward, the smoke from his cigar curling like a serpent between them. "You think you are being kind, Gary," Thorne rasped, his voice cold and clinical. "But you are actually being a coward. You are afraid of the friction that comes with the word no, so you have turned yourself into a bridge that everyone is happy to trample." Thorne introduced a concept that chilled Gary to the bone: strategic cruelty. He explained that by constantly catching every falling glass, Gary had robbed the people around him of the consequences of their own incompetence. "If you always fix the leak before the floor gets wet, they will never believe the roof is broken," Thorne said. "True power isn't in how much you can carry. It's in your willingness to set it down and watch it shatter." He taught Gary that kindness without the capacity for coldness is merely a lack of options. To be respected, Gary had to become dangerous. He had to allow the projects to fail, the deadlines to pass, and the demands to go unanswered. Only when the silence of his absence became deafening would they realize that he wasn't a servant, but the very foundation they had been too arrogant to acknowledge. Gary left the lounge that night, no longer seeking love, but prepared to wield the weapon of his own disappearance. Would you like me to proceed to Chapter 4, where Gary begins the great refusal and faces the immediate backlash of his new boundaries? Chapter 4. The Power of the No. The Cold Winter. Gary C. Charles stops answering the phone. He stops doing favors. He watches as the people around him scramble and eventually try to guilt-trip him. He remains unmoved. The transformation began with a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. Gary C. Charles entered his cold winter, a season where the man who once lived to serve simply ceased to exist for those who hunted his time. His phone, once a buzzing instrument of other people's emergencies, became a graveyard of unanswered texts and ignored calls. When the first weekend request arrived from Marcus, a casual demand disguised as a favor, Gary didn't offer an excuse or an apology. he offered nothing. He sat in the quiet of his own home, reading a book, while the digital world screamed for his attention. The scrambling began almost immediately. At the office, the gears of the department started to grind and smoke. Without Gary's invisible hand smoothing the edges, deadlines were missed, and errors piled up like uncollected trash. The people who had once patted him on the back now turned to him with frantic eyes, their entitlement quickly curdling into a desperate, manipulative anger. "We're a team, Gary," they pleaded. "We're drowning here." When that failed, the guilt-tripping became a surgical strike. They called him selfish. They whispered that he had changed, that he was letting everyone down. Elena, his cousin, sent a barrage of messages accusing him of abandoning family in her hour of need, an hour that seemed to last for years. Gary watched it all from behind a glass wall of detachment. He felt the old familiar tug of guilt, the urge to apologize and fix the chaos, but he anchored himself to the Machiavellian truth. Their crisis was the result of their own parasitic reliance. He remained unmoved, a stone in the middle of a rushing river. He watched the people who had never thanked him for his presence now curse him for his absence. It was in this cold, calculated silence that Gary finally felt a spark of something he hadn't known in years. Not the fleeting warmth of being liked, but the steady, ironclad foundation of being feared. Would you like me to conclude with Chapter 5, The Transformation, where we see the final shift from exploitation to true, earned respect? Chapter 5, The New Standard, The Ending. Gary C. Charles is no longer the nicest man in the room, but he is the most respected. He helps only those who contribute to his life. Closing quote. Be a person of value, not a person of service. When the frost of Gary C. Charles's cold winter finally began to thaw, a new landscape emerged from the wreckage of his former life. The office didn't collapse, and his family didn't perish. Instead, they adapted. The colleagues who once dumped their failures on his desk now approached him with a hesitant, newfound caution. They didn't barge into his office with demands disguised as favors. They knocked. They didn't assume his time was a public utility. They asked for it, and more importantly, they offered something in return. Gary had stopped being the nicest man in the room, and in doing so, he had become the most significant. His presence was no longer a given, it was a prize. Gary now lived by a cold, transactional clarity that protected his peace like a fortress. He helped the junior associate who stayed late to learn, but he ignored the senior manager who stayed late to exploit. He lent his wisdom to the cousin who worked to change her life, but he remained a ghost to the one who only called when the bill was due. He had traded the shallow, fleeting warmth of being liked for the heavy, enduring weight of being respected. People no longer smiled at him with the patronizing grin reserved for a useful servant. They looked him in the eye with the sobriety reserved for an equal. As Gary stood on the balcony of his own life, no longer exhausted by the weight of other people's dreams, he realized that the world doesn't reward those who give everything. It rewards those who know exactly what they are worth. He had finally mastered the dark art of boundaries, understanding that a hand that is always open can never hold on to its own power. He was no longer a bridge for others to walk over. He was the destination they had to earn the right to reach. Be a person of value, not a person of service.